We will let folks make their way in from the waiting room and get started in just a moment. All righty. Thank you to everyone joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn, Business Engagement, Climate Change, and Maine's Economy. And thank you to everyone who is watching this recording on YouTube. Businesses of all sizes and types realize that climate change is going to have a greater impact on our economy than anything we've ever experienced before, and that they have to adapt and change the way they operate in order to thrive in the future. At the same time, businesses want to help each other learn and grow. Some are reinventing their existing companies. Others are starting new ones to design and build the products and services that a carbon-constrained economy will need. In Maine and across the region, there are incredible resources to help businesses face climate and economic upheaval head-on and to turn all of those challenges into opportunities. We are delighted to learn about several of them today. We have Jeff Marks from ClimateWork Maine with us, Aaron Frederick joining from the Northeast Clean Energy Council, where he serves as ecosystem and strategic engagement consultant, and Eliza Donoghue, the executive director of Maine Renewable Energy Association. Thank you all for being with us today. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to building a just, thriving future for all by acting on the climate crisis, protecting the environment, and safeguarding our democracy. MCA does that by bringing people and organizations together to advocate, inspire, and educate. And MCV by advocating for equitable policies, holding elected officials accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space to explore our environmental and social history, policy priorities, climate action movement, and more. A few notes before we dive in. We will hear from our speakers first and tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait, though. You can send questions to me or to Maggie Summers through the chat whenever they occur to you. We'll synthesize them and ask as many as possible in the Q&A following the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, please message Maggie. She is the one to help you out. This event is being recorded, and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon. You can also find recordings of all of our programs on YouTube, where there are a bunch of different playlists to help you focus in on particular topics. Thank you again for joining us. And Jeff, I am going to turn it over to you to start things off.
Hey, thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Maggie. Can you hear me all right? Well, good, and thanks for Maine Conservation Voters for hosting this today. You know, when we first started talking about this, there were so many different ways that I could approach this. I could give out stats, economic stats on, you know, what climate means for the economy and how businesses figure into that. I could just run through several different case studies on what businesses that have climate action plans are doing. But because Maine Conservation is such a partnership-driven engagement organization, I thought I would talk about that piece of it and how environmental groups and businesses can work together and how we at ClimateWork Maine are engaging the business community. So if you could go to the next slide, Maggie. So for those of you who are not familiar with us, ClimateWork Maine, we are a support network for businesses in Maine. We're really trying to identify the challenges related to climate and seize the opportunities to build a more sustainable economy in the state. And the idea of ClimateWork Maine was conceived during the pandemic. Our founder, Alan Karen, invited me over to his place in Freeport. We discussed the idea with other business leaders, and we all agreed with what Kathleen said at the outset of this. Climate change is really the defining issue of our time, and if we're going to do anything about it, we need to engage the business community. The next slide. So this just gives kind of the very basic of what we're trying to do. We're providing services and networking to companies and really promoting companies that are already doing something on climate. But what we really want to do is reach those businesses in Maine that, they're just trying to sell products and services and meet payroll and provide health care to their workers, and they might not have time to think about climate, or they might have different perspectives on how climate change affects their business or in their industry. So anything that we can do as far as information and connections to help them grow and succeed, and hopefully do that in a way that reduces their carbon footprint, that's a success in our mind. Next slide. So we are we're following the climate action plan, just like Maine conservation voters are doing. They're influencing that. And if a company wants to become involved with ClimateWork Maine, we don't have a big set of criteria for that, but we do expect them to support the climate action plan in the state to some degree. Maybe not all of it, but some of it. We have one of the most comprehensive climate action plans in the country. It covers buildings, electricity grid, transportation, resiliency, and it focuses on all different types of constituencies, including the business community. So we want to be as aligned with the climate action plan as possible and use that as a blueprint when we're assisting the companies that we're working with. Next slide. Of course, when you approach a lot of companies, they're kind of they're not if they don't fully understand the issue and it's outside their perceived scope of business, it's tough for them to wrap their arms around it. So sometimes there's a lot of climate that's none of our business. Next slide. But really, climate change is everyone's business. And sorry about the really small print, but these are the types of companies and industries that we're working with in Maine. Everything from the legal profession to insurance to our heritage industries like farming, forestry, and fishing. Of course, we have clean energy companies in the state. We have fossil fuel companies in the state, and learning how we can transition workers from the fossil fuel industry into the clean energy industry. That's one of the things that we're working on. But there's just it's not just one type of company, one business in your community. Everybody has some type of connection to the climate, and we want to make sure that everybody knows it's everyone's business. Next slide. This is also a little bit word heavy, but there's a lot of things out there that are driving business action. There's international activity with the Paris Climate Agreement and the COP meetings that have been happening over the last few years. There are massive dollars coming from Washington, D.C. now to going into climate programs around the state and around the country. And we want to make sure that our companies are able to access that. There are regulatory and legislative policy issues going on at the federal and state level. There are companies who are developing innovative technologies that will somehow get to the climate solution. And, we have big energy and big climate issues to deal with in Maine. We need to figure out, okay, we want to generate clean energy. How do we get it from point A to point B? How do we do that in a way where we can modernize the electricity grid and decarbonize it? How do we electrify everything that we use in our life? There's just a lot of things going on in the climate area that interest businesses, and there are opportunities as well as the challenges that you hear about quite a bit. Next slide. So these are the types of things that ClimateWork Maine is trying to do. We're trying to connect companies to the information, like I said earlier, that they need to grow and succeed, hire people, have sustainable jobs going forward. We want to be able to promote new technologies and strategies that companies can use to reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions, but also work with their suppliers and customers to combat climate change as well. The reason I'm on the call today, we want to collaborate with others on climate, energy, and environmental issues. We really want to develop Maine as give it an image and a brand that shows that it's a climate savvy state and it welcomes businesses, workers, and others from out of the state to come in and help us in the climate activities that we're engaged in. So there's a lot of things that we're doing as an organization. Next slide. One of these, and this is something that we are going to slowly launch over the next year or so. We call it the Maine Cabin, and Cabin is Climate Action Business and Innovation Network. And the cabin will have all kinds of rooms and different components to it on how businesses can engage on climate and sustainability and clean energy in different ways, where we'll be holding events around the state. We'll be teaming up with local chambers of commerce to get to those areas of the state that might not be thinking about climate as much as some of our southern companies might be doing. We'll build partner networks. We're really focused on entrepreneurs and startups and how to help them with their innovative climate products. We want to build a kind of a clearinghouse of information. So if you're a company that wants to do something within your operations, or if you want to market your product in a new way, we can help them do that. And of course, work on workforce and economic development issues with our partners. Next slide. Most immediately, just 6 days from now, on Thursday, May 9th, we're holding our second summit on Maine's climate and economy, and we're doing that in Augusta. We had our first one last year. It was a bit of a test of concept to see if an organization like ours would be value added to companies and others in the state. And we invite all of you to attend. We're going to be, again, we'll have conversations on big issues from workforce needs to migration to just how we can all work together on big climate and clean energy projects within the state. And last slide. And if you're interested, feel free to reach out to me. There's a code that you can use to register for a discount, but we welcome not just businesses to our events, but members of the general public, environmental groups, government officials. We want this to be a room full of people who want to do something on climate and do it together. So thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. I'll jump right in. This is Aaron Frederick. I'm happy to be here with you all. I see some familiar names and faces out there. I'm holding the role of a VP of Strategic Engagement with the Northeast Clean Energy Council. It's a relatively new role for me, starting back in the beginning of February. I originally worked with them as a strategic planning consultant last fall and into the winter. And I was so impressed with the work that they were doing that ultimately found myself in a seat with the organization, working regionally on climate issues. And the big work of NECEC is to bridge between the public, the private, and the nonprofit and community-based sectors to advance our agenda, advance the climate transition. You can go to the next slide, Maggie. Thank you. So the mission is to lead the just, equitable, and rapid transition to a clean energy future and a diverse climate economy. So a lot of the things Jeff talked about. Jeff, I'm a little sad I didn't get my discount code yesterday when I registered for next week. I'll be following up with you for that 10%. That this is one of the most complex issues humankind has ever confronted, right? This is a massive, gnarly problem. And so the job, ideally, just when we're dealing with strategic issues in an organization, often we'll bring in a facilitator to connect us with the right ideas or to bring the right voices to the table at the right time. And what I see with NECEC is that kind of facilitative role in the Northeast, and that's from New York to Maine and beyond, into the Maritimes, into Atlantic Canada. You can go ahead to the next slide, Mike, thanks. So the idea is that this is a transition revolution. It's going to change the way that we behave day to day. It will change the way we heat our homes, the way we move through the world. We all used to think of ourselves as consumers, and this transition is making us producers as well. And so we are, I think we're all understanding that, especially after the COVID pandemic or during the COVID pandemic, that our behaviors will shift as part of this. Okay, go ahead, next slide. The greatest mobilization in history. So these are imperfect infographics here, but they show the basic renewables percentages today. This is direct data from ISO New England and ISO New York, showing our energy split. You can see renewables there. You can see nuclear, and the rest of that is fossil fuel power generation. And if we look at the goals, when we talk about 90% or 100% renewables by 2050, we've got a long way to go. And we all know that that last 20 or 30% is going to be the hardest to realize. So one of the big shifts I wanted to bring up, and certainly as we talk about business related to climate, is that traditionally we want to have a bad guy. We want there to be a villain that we can all battle. And I think the fossil fuel companies are an easy target these days, just as the tobacco companies were an easy target during the smoking realization about health impacts of smoking, and certainly the recent opioid epidemic. We realize that, yes, the fossil fuel companies are responsible in a lot of ways for astroturfing and misinformation, but we are all part of the problem right now in a lot of ways. We're caught in a system where it's very hard to make the right choice. And so I like to think of it as a big dilemma. Like, we all need to put on our creative hats and we need to learn to think together to face these problems. And that's part of what ClimateWork Maine is doing, and you're hearing these, our NECEC and others are bringing minds to the table to think together, and that's the work. Next slide. The way that NECEC goes about doing that is in these ways. You can see this data taken from one of the .gov federal websites. This is US greenhouse gas emission by sector. You can see if we took care of electric power, industry, residential and commercial buildings, and transportation, pretty large slice of the pie for economic impact. if we want to have impact on the backcountry, we need to decarbonize the front country, right? This is how I like to think about it. If I want winter and I want to ski, the way that I need to go about doing that is dealing with things like the grid and my house and the big buildings where, where we all work and the way that we get to work. So how do we make those massive changes? Next slide, please, Maggie. Well, the first is to deal with the biggest machine on Earth, right? The grid could be thought of as the largest machine, a planet-sized machine. It's a massive obstacle and it's a huge opportunity. But we need to think about the grid as a systemic challenge that requires both large-scale systemic solutions and small solutions. So the question right now for voters is, who should pay, right? How are we going to pay for upgrading the grid? Right now, if we all decided as voters that we want renewable energy and nothing else, the grid would not be able to handle the kind of renewable power that we would like to choose. It's simply not designed for distributed energy. And so we're trying to determine what role should the state play, what the federal government, the fossil fuel companies, individual businesses, and Avangrid or Iberdrola or CMP or whoever we like to target to say, actually, you fix it. And what we realize is that that needs to be a we fix it conversation, and our votes matter, right? The way that we vote will determine whether or not we have solutions on some of these issues or whether we continue to kick the can down the field or the ball down the field, rather. Next slide, please. Workforce, and Jeff mentioned this. We need tens, if not hundreds of thousands of new workers to get the job done. I have a friend who's faculty at Maine Maritime Academy, and he said, look, if we wanted to approve offshore wind farms, let's say we get there in New Jersey and Maine and Massachusetts, then we need thousands of new able-bodied seamen to run ships that have not yet been built to run the cable to connect those offshore wind farms. So the level of coordination needed to get our educational institutions up to speed. Part of what I hope you're hearing in this is not that, oh my gosh, this problem is so big, we can't ever get at it, but that it really is upon the voting population to push our public sector to be supported by our nonprofits and push the private sector to make these systemic solutions a policy priority, a regulatory priority, right? So it's our voices that help to drive what action is taken or not. Next slide. And then finally, the big one we saw in Maine, we had this clean energy corridor issue come up, and we had a big people's referendum that said we'd like to connect, Canadian power to Boston, and Mainers said, actually, we don't want you to do that, and that's moving forward anyway. And in that process, tens of millions of dollars were spent that theoretically we could have spent on actual climate transition. And so siting and permitting, making choices about the design of the new grid, about where large-scale utility renewable power goes. People don't realize that it takes 10 times the land footprint to put in renewables than it does conventional fossil fuel. So our landscape will change, and we as environmental voters want to have these solutions, but then feel fearful when we see the changes in our landscape. So we need to talk about that. We need to be proactive about that. But we don't have a choice of not moving forward. So it's that dilemma I spoke to. How do we work across business and commissions to get the job done? Okay, next slide. Sorry, I'm taking so long. I'll happily share this along with Kathleen and others, but these are some of the ways that we can make it happen. Stay informed, advocate with your town and state planners to create plans so that they're proactive when the big 500-acre solar farm comes up for permit review. People aren't suddenly bowled over by the fact that this could happen in their town. We need it to happen, but we need it to happen in the right places. So The other thing you can do is, if you look at the IRA and these big federal monies, they've got the concept of adders, which say if you put solar panels on buildings, it's more expensive to do so than to put it out in a farm field somewhere. But there's funding available to make those things a priority, but we need to tell the legislators that that's a priority. So thank you so much. I'll turn it over to Eliza.
Great. Thanks so much, Aaron. And hi, everybody. Again, I'm Eliza Donoghue. I'm the Executive Director of the Maine Renewable Energy Association, or MREA. I'm so pleased to be in conversation with these Maine-based colleagues that are committed to understanding how and acting on how businesses can be a part of the climate solution. So who's MREA? The Maine Renewable Energy Association is a nonprofit association of renewable energy developers and producers, as well as businesses that support the renewable energy industry in Maine. You know, anywhere from construction contractors to environmental consultants and engineers to law firms. Our energy developer and generator members, they cross the technology spectrum anywhere from solar to onshore and offshore wind, hydro, tidal power. And increasingly, we have members that are in or are entering into the battery storage space. Next slide, please. So, or slide prior to that, Maggie, I believe. It doesn't matter. So MREA primarily functions as an advocate for the renewable energy industry in the Maine legislature and before the Maine Public Utilities Commission. Now, our aim in those venues is to create or protect policy, law, regulation, whatever it is, or whatever you want to call it, that encourages the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. You know, in one of our prep calls, Aaron really said it well. You know, our goal is to create a regulatory environment that causes or allows us to do a little bit better, you know, acknowledging that there is some inevitable strife in the renewable energy transition. And so during our really brief time together, I want to talk about some of the very recent ways that Maine law and policy has encouraged the renewable energy transition, and on the flip side, maybe created a regulatory environment in some ways that has or may discourage our renewable energy transition. Next slide, please. But let's, of course, start with the good news. So in 2019, right at the beginning of the Mills administration, Maine enacted law or statute that calls for 80% clean renewable energy by 2030 and 100% by 2050. In other words, 100% of retail electricity sales need to come from renewable resources in just 25 years. Now, that isn't a goal, it's the law. We got to do it. And what did that law do? It gave renewable energy developers, you know, members of MREA, confidence that they can invest in Maine, that Maine wants them to be there, so much so that they passed a law. Now, with that statutory change came other changes like renewable energy procurements. Those procurements basically tell Maine utilities, CMP, Versant, that a certain amount of energy that they sell to their customers needs to come from renewable resources, and that they must enter into long-term contracts with those renewable energy generators. Now, those long-term contracts, you know, 20, 25 years, they're a really big incentive. They're a guarantee of income for our members or for other developers for a long amount of time. And that gives their investors confidence and security, so much so that the generators can sell their electricity at a super competitive rate. That cost matters. Making sure the renewable energy transition is cost effective is really elemental to this transition. So that's the good news. You know, Maine does a lot of really great things to encourage renewable energy transition and make Maine a hospitable place for renewable energy. But it also has veered off in some places. Let's go to the next slide. So Also in 2019, Maine passed landmark solar legislation that led to a boom in smaller scale or community solar development. Those smaller size projects, the ones that you might see in your community, occupying a few acres, they're a really big deal. They allow the average Mainer to the ability to offset their electricity bill and also do things like improve, for instance, Maine's electricity distribution system. Often those solar panels, they're accompanied by upgrades to the wires around them. Not to mention, of course, the climate benefits. So that 2019 law really put Maine on the map and inspired many in the community solar industry to come to Maine, moving us further toward those statutory targets and causing an incredible amount of investment in Maine. But regrettably, the Maine legislature has since, and really twice now since 2019, ratcheted back that 2019 law, decreasing the incentive to build smaller scale solar in Maine, and in many cases causing those developers to lose money that they invested once with confidence. Basically, Maine made promises to those developers. They spent money here in the state. Those promises were retracted, and in some places, or in some instances, in many instances really, that money was left on the table with no solar projects or climate benefits to show for it. I know Shirley, obviously we're all driving around the state. We see it. Many of those smaller scale solar projects have been successful, but really many have not as well. Maine, by ratcheting back a law that developers had already relied on, created a regulatory atmosphere that frankly has caused many in the renewable energy industry to think twice about investing in Maine. So I believe Maine can do better. And that is the big role that MREA plays. We're actively working on, in the Maine legislature, in the Public Utilities and Commission, with the Mills administration, on maintaining and building that regulatory atmosphere that inspires businesses to come to and stay in Maine, fueling our renewable energy transition and growing our renewable energy industry. So I'm going to leave it at that and pass it back to Kathleen.
Thank you, Eliza. Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Jeff. It is really great to have you all with us today, and you gave us a lot to think about. Before we get into questions, which we already have some, and folks should continue to keep sending those to me and to Maggie, I want to let you know that you will all get an email later this afternoon with a link to this recording, some information about that ClimateWork Maine Summit that Jeff talked about, as well as that sought after discount code. Erin, sorry we didn't share it yesterday, but I know a guy. I'm happy to make some introductions. So it would really be lovely to see all of you at that summit, and let's get into it. I really appreciate the sort of where you started, Jeff, with that high level. Like, we could talk about a lot of different things when we talk about businesses and climate action, right? We could talk about individual business owners making energy efficiency improvements in their brick and mortar locations. We also talked really big picture today about something that I don't think we do a great job talking about as advocates, which is the regulatory atmosphere. And so before we get into a bunch of questions about that, I would love to just ask Eliza, could you say a little bit more, and starting with Eliza, and then we can open it up. What do you mean when you say regulatory atmosphere? What does that mean in practice, and how would regular people interact with that or know what it means?
Yeah, happy to answer that question. So regulatory atmosphere means putting laws on the books that are aligned with our values, and then kind of sticking to those laws that are aligned with our values. Again, I as I mentioned in my presentation, Maine, particularly starting in 2019, really did an excellent job setting the stage, saying these are our goals, these are our statutory goals. That's a great example of a regulatory atmosphere. But then part of that regulatory atmosphere is about sticking to those promises, having incredible, having what's the word? Really abrupt changes in regulation creates this element of risk, and one that does not give people who are looking to spend money in Maine, for instance, and in other reasons as well, doesn't give them the confidence that they need in order to kind of put money down. And it's not just the confidence of those people who are actually spending the money, it's the investors that are giving them that money. They want to know that their investment that they're making is good for the long term. And one of the ways that we get to, creating and sustaining a positive regulatory atmosphere for our renewable transition is something that MCV does so well. We get people elected to office who can appreciate that that we need to kind of maintain that here in Maine, and we absolutely don't need to do things, for instance, like enact retroactive laws that are going to really pull the rug out of people who have come to Maine with confidence and enthusiasm.
Thank you. That is really helpful, and really connecting those dots between the sort of aspirational policy ideas that we start with, and then the laws we enact, and then the rules and regulations that really put those into practice and are the foundation of the action we need to see. That's so helpful. Erin and Jeff, I want to give you a chance to add anything you may want to about sort of the what we mean when we talk about regulatory atmosphere, and what people can do, and maybe what your organizations are doing to help shape that, and connect those dots from the change we want to see to the conditions we create to support that change.
Go ahead, Erin, I'll follow you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks, Kathleen. And it's been a crash course for me, lots of drinking from the fire hose on statutory frameworks and better understanding, how that works. The explanation I like best is the notion of handrails and backstop, the idea that there's an operative, a territory within which businesses, grid utilities, entities can operate, and that the regulatory environment is established to give a clear invitation to people to come in and play. What has been fascinating for me is to watch the state of Massachusetts with entities that have emerged, like the GMAC and the ESMP projects. That's the Grid Modernization Advisory Committee Council and the Electric Sector Modernization Plan. These entities have really worked with the legislators to give them the expert knowledge that they would need to create statute and to create the right laws, right? Legislators are not experts in grid management or in the electric sector. And so they really rely on industry and experts to help advise them on the kind of legislation that can work, right? And so this is where that private sector, public sector collaboration needs to come in. And it's where, groups like the Natural Resources Council of Maine or the Citizens Climate Lobby or others who have a more environmental take or a more social justice take can enter into the conversation and ensure that their objectives are addressed there as well. So the collaborations during this process, and sometimes, mini battles and conflicts, help us create the kind of statutory framework we want.
Really appreciate that, Erin. Did you want to add on, Jeff?
I'll jump in. So a long time ago, I used to work for a large conservative business organization in Washington, D.C. And anytime a change in legislation or regulation came about, whether it was clean air, clean water, Endangered Species Act, toxic release inventory, they always played, and me on behalf of them, played a very defensive role. We didn't want that change. We didn't want anything that could impact business decisions in a way that, quite frankly, would reduce that bottom line in some way. Fast forward to today, in Maine and in other states, and even within those organizations in DC, there's a recognition now that change can be okay, change can be good, change can be financially lucrative as well as environmentally friendly. So that intersection between economic development and prosperity and environmental improvement is much closer than it was when I was in DC many years ago. Eliza mentioned regulatory certainty. That is still very important. Whether it's improving environmental laws or any rollbacks, not very many companies want to see either one. They want to know what they have to do now, and they also want to be able to plan for 2, 5, 10 years into the future. So that regulatory atmosphere is still important, but it's refreshing to see that businesses are part of the policy development now, and they're doing it in a proactive way rather than playing defense on every single proposal that comes up in the policy arena.
Jeff, I love your personal career arc, and thank you for sharing that. And I also love that observation that the business world is maybe not where it was a decade ago or 2 decades ago. It gives me a lot of comfort and confidence to hear that businesses are approaching this. And of course, we say businesses as if that's a monolith, but there's a lot of room in there. But I really appreciate that observation that there is an appetite for change and a recognition that it has to happen. And so you can be at the table or not, but we're not waiting, right? We're not gonna say, maybe we won't address the climate crisis. That's not one of the options on the table. So I want to think a little bit about the businesses that do come to each of your organizations and how they're working with each other, how they're working with you. Like, what is the first step? If a business owner is on this call right now and saying, gosh, I would love some guidance in thinking about how I can be at the table. What do you suggest? What do they do next? Other than come to the summit next week.
Be on calls like this. I can start with that. You know, we're a fairly new organization, and we've been around for almost a couple of years now. What we've spent a lot of time in the beginning is working with companies that are already doing something on climate. They have climate action plans, they have sustainability strategies, and really helping to promote what they're already doing. But what we'd really like to do as an organization is start going out to different parts of the state, more rural parts of the state, work with local chambers of commerce, invite companies in to just talk with us, have conversations. We find out what their priorities are and talk about climate as an environmental issue, but also as an economic one. What can you do within your company to save money? What can you do to provide a better quality of life for your workers? What can you do to create a better product or service for your customers? So it's that type of, one-on-one conversations with companies, both in southern Maine as well as northern Maine, and just get to know what they're doing. So I would invite people to just call Eliza, Aaron, sorry to open up your phone lines like that, or me, and just talk about how you might want to help the organization or connect to a company that might be helpful in an initiative that you're working on, and just to get to know these organizations. NECEC, I've been working with them for years. They bring in a perspective that we don't always have. They're working with companies throughout the Northeast. They have access to resources and information that we might not have readily available here in Maine. So absolutely get to know organizations like NECEC and Maine Renewable, because they're doing big things and they're working with companies to the benefit of all.
I'll piggyback on that. Thanks, Jeff and Kathleen. One of the things that NECEC does biweekly across a number of different issue areas is convene working group calls specifically focused on policy. So when there are those working conditions that need to be set to optimize your ability to make good climate choices, transition related choices, there's a place for you to come together and say, this is what we care about. This is what would need to be true for us to do our work well. Many companies and organizations are, as Jeff said, on their toes. They're on ESG issues in general. But I think a lot of entities are coming up with a climate approach. If you look at the EU, where the regulatory environment is much more stringent around the climate transition, maybe a bit more ambitious, it's been around a little longer. There's some incredible progress. There are lots of consulting firms helping companies come up with climate transition plans, and there's like a mandate to do so. We're not there, though. The SEC just put out, some new reporting requirements for publicly traded companies. That's a big deal. We have small companies in Maine, mostly small and mid-sized companies. So, the feds are not requiring us to say, these are the climate risks we're taking. But I think having a table to sit around and talk through what's hard, what you're trying to achieve is absolutely key. I think like Jeff and Eliza, if we don't yet have a table for you or your group, holler at us, become a member, and then demand one. I think this is what we're here to do. We just need to hear from the constituents that this is what you need. So yeah, speak up, please.
Thank you for that invitation. I love that. One of the things that I heard each of you mention, I think, is the process of permitting and some of the sort of steps that businesses need to go through in order to put clean energy projects in place. Quick plug for next week's Lunch and Learn, which is permitting the clean energy future. So we're going to pick up on all of this, but let's get a quick preview. There's been a lot of talk about permitting at the local, state, and federal levels. And I'm wondering, with local politics and municipal policies being one of the easiest and most direct places for individuals to plug in, maybe we could start there with what role does municipal law play in our renewable energy transition? And then maybe we can build on that and get to a little bit of what's all this talk about federal permitting reform, and are you all working on that? So that's where we want to go. Who wants to start?
Happy to kick off that one.
Thanks,
Kathleen.
Eliza.
Kathleen knows how much I love land use and renewable energy. So I think one of the most basic places to start is that Maine is a home rule state. That means our municipalities have a lot of control about what happens within their borders. And that's really great news. That is, I think, a big part of what makes Maine's communities strong, what allows some autonomy and creative thinking on the part of municipalities. But what that also means is that municipalities have an opportunity to say a really firm no to new renewable energy projects. And it's absolutely the case that there are a lot of places in Maine where locating new solar, new wind, new transmission lines is not right. But there's still a lot of places where it is the right thing, but it is an appropriate land use. And so what I've done in my work at MREA and in past positions is helping municipalities understand how they can say yes to renewable energy and really encourage those municipalities to think long and hard about making that area as expansive and permissible as possible. Because sadly, we're seeing a lot of places throughout Maine putting up moratoriums for new renewable energy development. They can't say an absolute no because of various, existing policies, but they can put such significant constraints on new renewable energy development that practically speaking, those projects can't be located in Maine. So I think that while it's incredibly important for municipal leaders to think about what is best for their community, it's also important for them to realize that if everybody says no, then we're not going to get any of these projects anywhere. And that's particularly the case for new transmission. Aaron already alluded to this, but we're going to need to really build out our grid in order for us to realize our renewable energy transmission. And that's going to mean, putting up some more wires in Maine, a lot of wires and a lot of really long ones that are going to cross a bunch of different municipalities. And if there are so many kind of outside constraints on where that transmission can be located, that if even one municipality says no, or particularly if that municipality is in a specific situation or specifically placed, then we are totally out of luck. And that means it's a huge barrier towards meeting those larger renewable energy goals. So there's a lot of resources out there for how municipalities can think about how they can make changes to their various planning documents, to their regulations. The state of Maine, the Mills Administration is putting together even more resources to help support municipalities, particularly because so many Maine municipalities have limited resources, but really figuring out those places where municipalities can come to yes. And be proud of locating that big solar project, because sometimes, frankly, it's and thanks for the applause, Nick. It's it can sometimes be like okay, do you want a big solar project or do you want a big subdivision? And frankly, often the impacts of a solar project as compared to a subdivision are much, much less. And there are real opportunities to design, implement those. I'm using solar as an example in a way that it makes it a cohesive part of a municipality.
Can I jump on there? I just would say that the invitation in that I mentioned early in my slides there, that we're in a revolution, a transition, and that's in the way that we think as well. And the invitation here is really a values-based shift to recognizing our role as a species on a planet, right? That is the radical awakening for a lot of us, that we need to pay attention to the way we use resources in a way that we've been relatively ignorant of or not paying much attention to. And thinking like a collective, thinking like a community, a state, a nation, a species is not something we're great at. We like to think about our bit, and then everybody else is out there. So I think for Maine, we saw it in the referendum last year with a clean energy corridor. There's a sense of our borders, where a lot of folk around us are looking at the region saying, boy, wouldn't it be handy to connect all that Quebec-based hydropower over to the Boston metro area? For a lot of reasons, Maine did not want to play like that. And but I think this is the invitation and the challenge is thinking slightly outside our political boundaries and having a sense of what we might want, which is different than saying, not in my backyard.
Jeff, you unmuted. I don't want to cut you off.
If we want to decarbonize the electricity grid, if we want to electrify our transportation and buildings, we do need to come to a solution on siting and permitting these big projects. And not to plug our own summit once again, but in the morning on May 9th, we're going to bring in 4 of the major players in the entire Western Maine corridor discussion and talk about finding common ground and what we can do to work better together in the future on making sure that we can get clean energy from point A to point B. Because we're going to need these big projects if we're going to meet the climate challenge.
I really appreciate that, and I'm thinking a lot about this, tension that we all face and all are sort of grappling with of the urgency of climate action and of building out a clean renewable energy resources and grid to support them. And also thinking about how we got here and who has been harmed along the way and how we can do better going forward. And so I saving this gigantic question for the lightning round here at the end. But just, a lot of the cost of this, there are real costs to making this transition. I think they pale in comparison to the cost of not making this transition, but they are real. And I wonder if you have just a 1-minute lightning round of who is bearing these costs, and how do we make sure, what is the role of business in making sure that it is an equitable transition that doesn't happen on the backs of folks who have been harmed by the status quo? By the way, that's a pro facilitator move. Don't prep people for a huge question and then give them 1 minute to answer it. Thank you.
I'll just speak on behalf of NECEC and say that the explicit mission of the organization for the last 2 years has been to diversify the board, to diversify the staff, to ensure that our alliances with community environmental justice organizations are strong and active. And it's been a lot of work, that what they call last mile work, where to actually get into the community and be connected requires a lot more than you might think. And it's doing powerful things for the perspective, but it's hard. It's hard for a traditionally white, male, and older business community to begin to shift into and adopt. We used to be a clean energy organization. Now we're a climate transition organization, bigger tent. So.
Gold star for taking that big question on and summing it up so nicely. Thank you, Erin. Eliza, you're up next.
Yeah, big question, small amount of time. I think what comes to mind is bringing it back to where the first question you posited, which was about regulatory certainty. As I mentioned before, that regulatory certainty gives investors confidence in investing in those projects. More of that influx of money means less of a cost shift over to regular folk. So that's kind of a backwards way of saying elections really matter. I think also always emphasizing really making a comparison of the cost of doing nothing, as Kathleen always said. We can't repeat that more and more. And also often realizing that many of the benefits of this renewable energy transition are ones that are not traditionally monetizable. Understanding, the health, the positive health impacts that come with renewable energy transition, really keeping those top of mind. You aren't necessarily going to see those in your electricity bill, but you are going to feel them in your body. They're going to be ultimate cost savings in reducing your healthcare costs and all those things as well. And then I think finally, in thinking about keeping the cost of renewable energy low, getting back maybe to the land use and, how we kind of integrate these projects into our communities. Often some of the strategies that can make renewable energy more palatable to the average person, they often cost a lot too. So it's important that we understand that there can be a trade-off, that like, yes, perhaps a solar project that's a parking lot canopy seems like a really great idea, and it is, and is a great fit in so many places. But don't forget that also they're much more expensive. Again, there's all of these are like case by case project scenarios. I'm making kind of broad statements, but let's make sure that we don't allow the perfect to get in the way of the good, because sometimes that perfect, it costs a lot of money, and that money is going to trickle down to the people who have, again, are not able to absorb those costs into their larger budgets.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Eliza. Great points. Jeff, bring us home.
Yeah, I'll end where I started. Build better partnerships, bring the stakeholders in early in the process whenever you're doing any of these projects, and really try not to think about it with one perspective. The environmental is extremely important, but think about the economic and the costs and the equity issues and the energy security, and try to think of those collectively and come to a decision after receiving a wide variety of perspectives on this, and not just take a narrow approach.
None of this is easy and none of it is simple. Really, really well said. Thank you for sharing today. Thank you for all of the work that you are doing. And thank you to everyone who spent this hour with us. You'll get a follow-up email this afternoon. Hope to see many of you at the ClimateWork Summit next Thursday, and all of you at the Lunch and Learn on Permitting the Clean Energy Future this time and space next week. So until then, have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Thank you to Aaron, to Eliza, to Jeff. Thanks to all of you, and we will see you soon.